Good morning everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to present today about visual cognition, visual processing and learning, and the impact visual processing problems can have on learning potential. This is just for your own records, an abstract of this presentation and our intended learning outcomes, that by the end of this session, delegates should have a current evidence-based understanding of the role of vision in learning, in particular in special needs populations, provide an evidence-based rationale arguing for the routine assessment of visual information processing or cognition skills in primary age children, and be able to identify when assessment may be indicated from parental teacher observations of child behaviour. So what is visual processing? Well, in a nutshell, I think the best way to describe this is it's about the brain, in particular, more specifically, the visual cortex, and it's not just about the eyes. The eyes are the vehicle that sends the information across, but visual processing is about the brain. It's how we interpret and make sense of visual information that travels from the eyes to the visual cortex. So this slide shows a visual search task. How many orange cats can you find? So I'll give you a few minutes to do that while I chat. This task often is used as a tool, as a reflection of visual cognitive processing. And in the research domain, it's certainly been shown to suggest that it can serve as a predictor of reading and learning challenges. Did everybody find 8 orange cats? I certainly hope so. So visual search tasks that probably might be a little bit more familiar to you are targets at games like Where's Wally or Spot the Difference puzzles. Let's now take a moment to explore the importance of visual processing. Good visual processing is not just a skill, it's crucial for early learning or early primary or elementary learning. Children need to be able to recognise letters and words to achieve reading success. But if there are deficits during these early years, it can lead to confusion between, discriminating between letters that look similar, like B and D or P and Q, even between the numbers the letters S and number 5. They may have trouble tracking tracking words on a page, or even using their visual memory to remember visual details. And all of these elements of visual processing play a very significant role, in particular in the learning to read phase, and that sort of prep to grade 3. So it's essential we pay attention to their visual processing skills early. So in a nutshell, recognising visual processing difficulties early can have a profound impact on a child's development. It allows teachers to tailor teaching methods and also to make accommodations to the learning environment for the child. So when is an ideal time to have visual cognitive skills assessed in children? Well, the best sort of optimal window of opportunity is between the ages of sort of 5 to 8 or prep to year 2, before learning gaps manifest and when the visual processing skills are most crucial in the learning to read phase. But, and there's a big but, they first need to have their eyes tested. And I know in this audience you all know this intimately. Eye health, visual acuity, visual efficiency can all play a major role in how we develop our visual processing and performance skills. So we need to have these issues addressed first. So it is important to note, however, that visual cognitive problems can still persist or still be present in children, even in the absence of any eye health, eyesight, or binocular vision problems. So it's never that simple, but certainly as a precursor or as a triage, we need to make sure that children have their eyes and vision tested first. It's reported that visual cognitive skill deficits affect 1 in 20 children across the US in the general population. But did you know that visual cognitive problems are 4 times more common in children with learning difficulties, which is 1 in 5 children who'll struggle to make sense of that visual information travelling from the eyes to the brain. And what's worse, in children with a diagnosis of specific learning difficulties or dyslexia or specific reading problems, over 70% of those children struggle to process visual information. And yet this problem's often overlooked or even misdiagnosed because there's no simple way to test children early when starting school. One of the interesting points here is we certainly don't suggest or think that dyslexia is a simple matter of addressing visual problems and then they'll be right. We know it's far more complicated than that. But we do, and we can't ignore the fact that those children with this specific type of reading disability do have visual cognition issues that differ from the general population. And when we look at the research literature, we certainly do know that visual processing difficulties are more greatly represented in reading disability. And we also know in the literature that the best success is definitely after early identification and early intervention measures are put in place. Excuse me. It's the review paper from General Psychology, which reports that the impact of visual processing deficits is far-reaching beyond the reading and classroom environment, including well-being and children just responding to basic instruction inside and outside the classroom. This paper recommends a joint collaboration between parents, teachers, and professionals involved in the care of the child, so that the best tailored intervention and support strategies can be implemented with ongoing communication. So you've got this continual loop of communication to help boost the success for these children. When we look at specific subgroups of the population, and in particular this group would probably of great interest to you as educators in the vision space, children with cortical visual impairment. Well, the research suggests that CVI poses a more significant visual cognitive challenge than children who have ADHD or even dyslexia. And it certainly doesn't correlate directly with the level of visual acuity or visual impairment that the child may have. And that's really important. So you can't assume that a child that may have 6/12 acuity is going to somehow have better visual cognitive skills than a child with visual impairment and visual acuity of 660. Certainly really important to note that. This is still an emerging area in the research domain. There's a lot more being learnt and published about cortical visual impairment, far more now than ever has been in the research literature. So I think it's a watch this space area. When we think about children with autism, again, this is one of those areas that was largely overlooked, certainly in my career. And when I was, way back when I was a student and an early grad, I was given the impression in the research literature and by my mentors that children with autism, they had really good visual skills, or they didn't really differ from the general population when it came to vision. We're certainly seeing in the last 15, 20 years, in fact, that is in fact untrue. There's a variety of visual problems that are eye-related in terms of eye movements, binocular vision, and even refractive error that are far more overrepresented in children with autism than in the general population. And these children demonstrate visual cognitive challenges, or even, I'd argue, differences with the way they process visual information, visual attention, crowding, being able to filter visual information, and also their higher order visual functions. And certainly in the research literature, there's this growing concern that these children, we need to pay more attention with these children in terms of making sure that they have a comprehensive vision care program, including eye health, integrity, efficiency, as well as processing. I just wanted to touch on this definition of non-verbal learning disorders. Some of you may have heard this, or NVLD. It's an older term and it is going to be, I think, replaced, but it has created grave concerns in the learning space and in psychiatry and psychology more broadly, because NVLD, or nonverbal learning disorders, has been lumped within general learning disorders in some of the definition manuals that we turn to when we're trying to classify a condition relating to learning in children. And that's caused all sorts of problems because the vision part of it has sort of been buried within the broader frame of learning disabilities. And this is a really new paper that it's taken years to develop, but it's only just been published. And it's been looking at these visual cognitive deficits with the notion of changing the term nonverbal learning disorders to developmental visual spatial disorder, emphasising and bringing back onto the map the concept of visual spatial processing as being the deficit rather than it being a broad learning difficulty. And this particular paper still argues that we're dealing with the same sort of prevalence based in the US population, but also arguing the point that we need early identification, and it's critical for that timely support that I've alluded to earlier in the learning to read phase. And certainly the treatment phase for if we're going to try and work with these children, certainly does include occupational therapy, and that's been recommended as one of the primary interventions from this review paper. So what's a developmental visual spatial disorder? Yet another acronym, I'm afraid. But certainly I think we're all talking about the same thing. When we talk about visual processing, when we talk about visual cognition, we really are referring to visual spatial attention, or referring to this concept now of developmental visual spatial disorder. It's how students process and understand visual information. And it's certainly defined as not being due to attention deficit issues. And it's also been highlighted that it's often underdiagnosed, misdiagnosed, or diagnosed late because it can be masked by strong verbal skills, making it harder to identify in the classroom. This paper goes on to talk about the common classroom challenges in children who typically might have this visual spatial disorder. And it includes a vast range of areas in the classroom that are challenges for these children. Writing and drawing, which are probably the most commonly understood, math, geometry, organisation, navigating your way around, that idea of following basic instructions. It even spreads into sports and physical activity, as well, of course, as reading and eye movements and scanning. And some of the behaviours that have been highlighted from these papers, these review papers, are that children may appear disorganised or forgetful, or struggle with multi-step tasks. They may respond better to verbal instruction than visual cues. And they might altogether learn strategies around mitigation or avoiding certain tasks. And it's certainly known to have far-reaching ramifications in terms of anxiety or low confidence in academic situations. These are our traditional methods that we use to explore visual cognitive skills, and so testing, is typically reflected in looking at discrimination, memory, visualization, sequencing skills, spatial skills, and then that concept of how we then tell our motor or our body what we do with the visual information that we have in terms of visual motor integration. So why assess visual processing skills? Well, hopefully a little bit of what I've described will already be self-explanatory, but we want to detect where there may be gaps in how information is being processed early. We want to be able to then implement individualised support programs for children who may have learning challenges from this type of visual processing difference. And we might need to address behavioural concerns that are a consequence of these types of challenges and struggles that may occur in the learning space. There are multiple intervention approaches, and this area does need to be explored further, I think, in the research domain. In particular, vision therapy and where it fits, in particular occupational therapy and where it fits. What educational strategies can we implement as educators? What remedial reading programs work best or not? what environmental modifications should be implemented and which ones work best. There's a lot of work to be done in this space, and we are really only scratching the surface in this domain, as it has been largely overlooked for many, many years. As educators, observing key behaviours might indicate the possibility of there being a possible visual processing deficit and that requirement for assessment. But this might be too late, and often it's not being used as a preemptive or preventative approach. It's a reactionary approach to a behaviour that's been observed, some of which I've mentioned here that have come from a paper by Vis-CAT and Boulay on the visual impediments to learning. It's worth actually looking at that paper in more detail, but there's some of the behaviours that you might observe in a child that may have a visual processing deficit. How can educators help? Well, here are some of the accommodations and strategies that I'm sure you're already implementing in your own environments. The use of verbal cues, the idea of giving extra time, breaking down the tasks, providing some hands-on learning, seating a child strategically, and certainly encouraging self-advocacy so that children aren't afraid to let us know that they're having troubles. So this notion, I just want to end on this notion of preemptive learning, early testing, before there's learning gaps. Well, this is what I've spent most of my career trying to develop, and we've now brought it into a digital and online tool. And we've got this visual cognition assessment tool that uses a validated dot pattern methodology, and it tries to encompass all those elements of visual processing that we talked about earlier in relation to spatial attention, memory, sequencing skills, just to name a few. And for those of you who would like to have a little go, I've included this in the slides. It's just a dummy QR code. If you've got an iPad or a touchscreen device, scan the code or scan the URL here below, and you can have a go at what this dot pattern test is all about. We're in the process of still validating the tool in its digital form, and our colleagues here in Victoria have been working with us in the vision space, as well as educators in mainstream schools, as well as optometrists and occupational therapists and audiologists, I might add. They've all been using the tool as part of the validation and trials that we're undertaking at the moment. So I thank you. I know I've gone over time. I'll allow that, given I have been unwell, and I really apologise that I couldn't present at the conference. But I hope this has been helpful. Please feel free to make contact with me. I haven't included my email address, but it's just my surname at unimelb.edu.au. Thank you.